Hello and assalamualaikum and welcome to the Daisy Power podcast. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. It is still related to self-help, self-development, but it's in the context of keeping a hobby, but specifically language learning as that hobby. Now, if you're here, that means you're interested already in learning languages, but what are the possible benefits if you're just a beginner and you would want to know, right? So, mental stimulation, your brain stimulated, you get into a lifelong learning mindset. You get a cultural immersion. So you learn so much more and you realize, oh my gosh, there's a world just totally outside my own language, my own culture, my own norms and values too. And it's a very satisfying endeavor. Overall, it increases your confidence over time, it decreases your stress, and over time, I think your personality as a whole becomes more richer. So these are the reasons that, well, at least very few of them, that you would want to learn languages, right? For me personally, I started with Korean, and I did not expect that I would stick with Korean for this song, but I have. Um, and so I think I'm gonna do this part in Korean so that, you can also see how far I've come with my strategy and just overall things I've learned over the years and things I can tell you so that you can really speed up your own journey, right? 그럼 시작할게요. 저는 아비입니다. 그리고 저는 파키스탄 사람이요. 저는 왜 한국 공부하는데요? 이거 궁금해요. 그렇지? 그럼 대답 줄게요. 저는 처음에 K-드라마 때문에 시작했어요. 근데 나중에 그냥 언어 공부하는 재미있는 취미 생각해요. 이렇게 생각해요. 그리고 천천히, 많이 K-드라마 그리고 영어 봤어. 그리고 많이 팟캐스트 들리고 이렇게 친구들이랑 많이 말했어요. 그냥 친구들이랑. 이것 때문에 천천히 많이 배웠어요. 그리고 진짜 잘 말은 못해요. 근데 그냥 한국에 천천히 말할 수 있어요. So that was a little bit of my intro. And I basically just said that I initially started learning Korean as just for fun because of, movies and K-dramas and stuff. But eventually this transitioned into something that I became passionate about. And I think it's so cool when you can just turn around and talk to that person in a completely different language. Just a feeling of the fact that, oh my gosh, I can, it might seem like gibberish to people around you, but you're actually talking in a language with someone around the world can understand you. Like, isn't that just so cool? But obviously, you don't have to pick Korean or, Chinese or German. You can pick whatever language you want, but it's a pretty important decision, right? Because if you just pick any language out of the sake of picking that language, you might actually just end up going to scratch and picking another language down the line. And that's also okay because this is also just for fun, right? But you want to be able to spend enough time and become proficient in it, right? So it's better to start off on the right foot. So which language to pick? An easy test for that is try to look around for content in that language. So if you're looking to learn Chinese, look at some Chinese dramas, Chinese movies, maybe talk shows, comedy shows, and see if they interest you, right? If they do, then you can pursue that language. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to have like a hook that pulls you in, due to which you want to learn that language. Maybe you want to talk to people in your family who are from that country, or maybe you want to visit that country, or you have university in that country. These are pretty strong motivators. But if you don't have any of those, then finding content that you find fun is a pretty good way to start. Some languages that I could recommend trying to learn is Chinese. There's a lot of Chinese people, and you will have opportunities to talk to Chinese people because they're in a lot of countries. You could learn Urdu or Hindi. I'm not trying to be biased here, but it does have its benefits, specifically Urdu. Because if you learn Urdu, you automatically know Hindi. And if you learn Urdu, you have a head start for Arabic because Urdu, the way it's written, is similar to Arabic. Arabic is also a really good language to start, right? Because a lot of countries are like speaking Arabic, but the only problem is the distinction between modern standard Arabic and then all the dialects that are within that language. So that can become a bit complicated. And the other language that would be really helpful to learn is Spanish. If you're going to like US, UK side of the hemisphere, then I think it would be useful to learn Spanish because there's a lot of Spanish speaking people and that would be really fun if you can try to talk with them. The next thing I would want to discuss is how language learning should be over time. Like, there's a difference between traditional learning, but in these days it's shifting into modern learning, the different types of learning. So now that you've picked your target language, let's focus on how you want to learn that target language. So there is different modes of learning, right? There is the traditional mode of learning where you start with grammar, start with dozens of vocabulary, and you learn like all the colors, all the numbers, the different types of animals, the different type of foods and whatnot. But you can probably hear from the tone of my voice that I don't really support this type of language learning because I essentially know that this isn't the best way to go if you want to learn languages long term. Like, why would you need to know every single animal on the planet when you're never even gonna need that in regular conversation, right? Unless you work in a zoo, right? So these days, that's why they're shifting from traditional learning to a modern learning where you kind of absorb content from movies or drama series and you kind of just absorb it naturally. And it's shifting to understanding language learning like a baby would understand speaking for the first time. You know how babies take the first 5 years of their life just like taking an input and they learn how to say a few basic words and then they start piecing together sentences and eventually it takes them a lot of time, like maybe 5 years to start talking properly, but they do learn and they learn pretty naturally. They don't have to be taught grammar or rules or like vocabulary of every single thing on the planet, but they become fluent speakers pretty quickly, in fact. So there's a lot of YouTubers out there like Steve Kaufman. He's one of my favorites. He is a polyglot, which just means that he speaks a lot of languages. And he has an app called Link, Lingq, where he shares his language learning philosophy and other people can also learn using those techniques. So Steve Kaufman also believes that you don't need to learn a ton of grammar and a ton of, although it is essential at some point, but it's not like do or die situation. He says that input is like king, input wangida. You need to take a lot of input and then eventually start trying to get that input into output, right? Input may mean watching movies, listening to audio podcasts, and this is also another YouTuber, John's language learning method. So he's a foreigner who has learned Korean this way, and so he talks about this methodology now on YouTube. And he mentions this phrase, actually, both of them mention this phrase, immersion learning, which is you immerse yourself in the culture, in the language, and you eventually learn very naturally over time. Now, you obviously need to set your goals straight, right? Because if this is for business, it might not be, it's a good way to go, but you might want to filter your content specifically to that. You might want to watch more, um, I don't know, formal setting shows like news or comedy shows which use a more formal tone to their speaking, or maybe documentaries, because that's where your end goal is, right? But if you're just watching it for, I mean, if you're just learning a language for fun or just to speak to people, then you can just use like TV shows. And an interesting thing that I noticed recently was if you know what immersion learning is, right? It's like you take things in slowly. There's another term called comprehensible input. So if you take whatever language you want to learn, put it on YouTube and like Arabic comprehensible input, it will give you these videos which are very simply made, which you can understand even if you don't understand the language at all. And if you notice, that's exactly what like toddler TV series are like, right? They're very slow and they keep on repeating a lot of phrases. So that's comprehensible input. They keep them entertained, but it keeps it simple enough for the kid that it can like they can learn over time. And you really need to internalize that. It might seem like too slow or might want to rush into things, grab like 10 books, start learning everything, start learning all the grammar rules. But what's going to happen is you're going to burn out. So the way to think about language learning is that it's not a race, it's like a lifestyle now. So you have to like go slow and steady, and eventually you will get at a point where you can talk pretty much like an upper intermediate or intermediate level, but that takes time, that takes effort, and that takes consistency. And you can't be consistent if you burn yourself out too quick. So, moving on to methodologies, there's a lot of ways we can go about this, even if you follow the modern learning methodology. But a simple way, actually, most of these YouTubers say that you can just start off with just looking at TV shows, but I still think it would be much less frustrating if you take a basic beginner book and you learn from there initially. So you do that book, you learn, for example, if it's Korean or Arabic, you learn the alphabet, and you learn a few basic words like hello, how are you, make a few conversational statements, and that can give you a lot of confidence boost, right? From this, you can move on to the second step, which is watching comprehensible input, which I mentioned before. And if you can handle the frustration, also watch movies or dramas. Or if you don't even have that, you can even watch anime that's dubbed in that language. So that's a very useful guide. What I used to do over time is that I had like a lot of English subtitles when I was watching like TV series and stuff in Korean, but that also slows your progress down a little bit. So if you want to like take it in naturally, it's better to just leave subtitles off. And I know it can be frustrating, but you could watch it without the subtitles off, then watch it with the subtitles on, or you could just from every other scene. This is what John says is a good method, is that from every other scene you can pick a phrase which you don't understand or which catches your attention, that's been used a couple times, and you can try to pronounce it on like the Google speech option and look at Google images. That would like summarize what that word means without having to translate it in your base language, right? He says that if you can't even do that, if you can't pronounce the word properly, then that means you don't even need to look up that word right now. It means you just need to take in a bit more input so that your brain can start comprehending. Because unlike other hobbies, language learning is not just a conscious thing, it's also a subconscious thing. So your brain will automatically start sorting through the information and keeping it as such. And sometimes it's actually a good idea to keep things in one language rather than trying to switch in both languages. Have you ever seen transcribers? You know how, so this is another thing that John mentions, that it's like, it's very interesting because they switch every 15 minutes when they're transcribing stuff for speakers from one language to another. 15 minutes is a very short time, so why do they do that? It's because our brain is naturally programmed so that it can function in one language, but shifting languages for it is very difficult. And applying that principle in language learning, it would be better if you just Google the word instead of trying to look up in a dictionary or translate the word directly. So it's just better to look at the image than to actually translate it into English. And this you can also do in Link, which is the app by Steve Kaufman, which allows you to basically tap on a word, look at the meaning of that word. Over time, it also puts them all into flashcards. This is pretty helpful. So, whichever way suits you best, you can do that. You can either go directly for the movie approach where you try to say out the words that you don't understand, look at the Google images, or you can go to a link and it can just select those words and turn them into flashcards for you, or, you know, it has a lot of repetitive words, so it's good in that. But a con of Link is that it's obviously not free. But a huge pro is that it keeps all the beginner content that you're looking for in one place without you having to move a finger. And that's what can be difficult initially, because trying to look for content that's interesting and easy enough and you can easily try to comprehend it, not an easy task. It takes some time. So now you're taking in a lot of input, you're listening to words being said. Now you also need to listen to different podcasts during your free time. So now you're seeing words being spoken, but you're also listening to words being spoken. And after that, you can also practice your output, which is like using apps like Hillcall or Hibi, where you meet up with people, just audios, and it's a nice app. And you can just go over there and talk to other foreigners or people who are learning the same language and just practice with them and talk about different topics and how your day was and stuff like that. It's a very good methodology. So, to summarize, basic rules are 70% get loads of visual and auditory input. Listen to the same audio repeatedly or beginner podcasts as like a filler activity when you're, I don't know, washing your dishes or brushing your teeth or whatever, and practice 30% of the time that you are dedicating to the language. So the these are the ways you can really enhance your language learning process in a more natural way, in a way that is more consistent to you, because you want to be interested in it. You don't want to burn out. And that brings us to our last heading of today, which is things not to do when you're learning a language. Number one would be don't do too much too quickly. If you burn yourself out, you're just not going to learn it over time. If there's one person who learns every single day for an hour, just for a month, and then he gives up because he doesn't have the time for it, he will not learn as much as a person who uses their own downtime. Like if they're watching a drama, they're not taking much. It's not taking a lot of effort, but it's giving them 1 hour of input. They're hearing podcasts 30 minutes while they're moving around, and I don't know, and focusing, focus study base almost 20 minutes a day. So compared to the other person who was like spending a lot of time focus study, compared to the second person who's doing like 15 minutes of focus study, but who's doing a lot of casual learning, the second person would benefit more. He'd be able to take this as a sustainable hobby. It turns into something that's part of his lifestyle. So it's more natural for him to learn the language, right? It's a better way to go. The second thing is don't use Duolingo. I've never been a fan of Duolingo, and I've had friends say that, oh, it's really helpful. I can understand a lot because of Duolingo. And I decided to test it out, and I tried it for like almost 100 days. And after 100 days, I had to conclude that this was definitely not worth it. If I had spent an equal amount of time on Link, I would have learned much more faster than I would have just through Duolingo, because it gives you words that are out of context. You don't have any images to associate with the words, they're just words. And after so much time, you don't even know how to properly introduce yourself or hold up a basic conversation, because 100 days is a long time. You could have done a lot by then. So don't use apps like that. Just try to stick to the basics of immersion learning and watch a lot of comprehensible input videos or just basic movies and stuff. The third tip of things not to do is don't stick to your comfort zone by only listening to input with English subtitles. This is something I did with Korean learning, right? I used to use English subtitles for a long time, and I did learn a few common phrases that kept on repeating themselves, but for the most part, I would just read the words and I would ignore what's being said. But once I started turning off the subtitles, I kind of had to force myself to listen to what they were saying. So eventually I learned a lot more because of that, right? And I think the last tip would be don't stress yourself out too much. At the end of the day, it's just a hobby that you started because you love it. So feel proud of yourself for it. Even if you're doing it for a future goal, like if you're going to I don't know, study in that country, or if you wanna work in that country, maybe have a business partner or a family member. At the end of the day, you can only do well if you're mentally good to yourself, right? So be proud of yourself for how far you've come. Don't compare yourself to people. And I do that a lot. I still feel like at a lot of times I'm like, oh my gosh, do I even know how to speak in Korean? People are so much more better than me. I can't understand them. But at the end of the day, that's how it's gonna be, right? That's the part of the process. You can be really good at speaking, but eventually there will be people who speak a lot better than you. And that's also true in your mother tongue, right? You can't always be good. This is a problem with a lot of Pakistanis where we don't know Urdu as much as we know English, and we often mix the two. So even natives aren't 100% in that language, so don't expect yourself to be. So that's it for today's podcast, and I hope you had fun listening to it. I did have fun making it, and I hope you start a new language, find out how amazing this journey can be.